In October 1935, a bootlegger bled out on the floor of a New Jersey chop house, and with his last breath, the numbers racket he had stolen from Harlem slipped permanently into the hands of the American mafia. 6 years earlier, on 7th Avenue in Harlem, a Martinique-born immigrant named Stephanie St. Clair had built that very racket into an empire worth millions, running her operation from a walk-up office near West 135th Street in 1929. How a black immigrant woman came to control one of New York's largest illegal economies, and how she lost it to Dutch Schultz's guns, corrupt cops, and a mob truce struck over her head, is a story that explains who really profited from Harlem and who did not. To understand what was at stake, you have to understand what Harlem had become by the late 1920s. Between 1910 and 1930, roughly 175,000 black New Yorkers moved into a 50-block stretch of Upper Manhattan bounded loosely by Central Park North and 155th Street, 5th Avenue and St. Nicholas Avenue. Some came from the American South in the Great Migration. Others came from Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, and St. Clair's own Martinique, drawn by shipping routes that ran through New York Harbor and by word that Harlem's brownstones, built originally for white middle-class families, were opening to black tenants as white landlords fled and needed rent. By 1930, Harlem was the largest concentration of black urban life in the Western Hemisphere. It was also, structurally, a captive market. Downtown banks redlined its blocks before the term existed. Insurance companies refused policies to black families. Employers on Wall Street and in the garment district capped what jobs were even available. Into that vacuum stepped an economy. The city never legislated and never taxed. The numbers racket, often called policy, was elegantly simple. A bettor picked a 3-digit number, wagered anywhere from a penny to several dollars, and if the number hit, the payout ran as high as 600 to 1. The winning number itself was usually pulled from a public, unfalsifiable source, the last 3 digits of the daily clearinghouse, total published in the financial pages, or the total handle at a racetrack, precisely so bettors could trust it wasn't rigged from above. Runners walked the tenement stairwells of Lenox Avenue and 7th Avenue collecting slips, funneling them up to a bank that covered the payouts and pocketed the difference. It was a shadow financial system, and in a neighborhood where legitimate banks would not lend, it functioned as something close to one. Numbers profits built churches, they capitalized small businesses, they financed funerals and college tuition. They also, inevitably, attracted men who wanted a piece of Harlem without doing the work of building anything. The man usually credited with organizing Harlem's numbers into a real business was Caspar Holstein, a Virgin Islands-born clerk and Amsterdam News columnist, who is believed to have adapted the mechanics from Cuban bolita lottery games he'd encountered through Caribbean networks in the city. By the mid-1920s, Holstein was reportedly worth well over $1 million, and unlike the gangsters who would follow him, he plowed money back into Harlem, funding scholarships, backing the Amsterdam News, sponsoring literary prizes tied to the Harlem Renaissance. He was, for a while, proof that the racket could be a ladder rather than a trap. Then, in September 1928, 4 armed men kidnapped Holstein outside his apartment on West 148th Street and held him for a ransom reportedly near $50,000. He was released after several days, badly shaken, and though he returned to the numbers business, he never fully recovered his standing. The kidnapping was a warning Harlem should have read more carefully. The racket was profitable enough now that outsiders with guns were watching, and black bankers had no police department willing to protect them. Stephanie St. Clair had arrived in New York around 1912, one of thousands of Francophone Caribbean migrants who settled first in the tenements of Harlem's western blocks. Details of her earliest years in the city are thin and sometimes contradictory. She gave conflicting accounts of her own biography throughout her life, a habit that later frustrated police files and delights historians trying to pin her down. What is documented is that by the early 1920s, she had accumulated enough capital, reportedly around $10,000, to start her own numbers bank in 1923. She built it methodically, hiring dozens and eventually hundreds of runners, spreading risk across multiple collection points so that no single police raid could wipe her out. Within a few years, she was known across Harlem by a title she cultivated herself, Madam Queen, or simply Queenie. She dressed in furs and pearls, drove through Harlem in a chauffeured car, and carried herself less like a criminal boss than like the head of a legitimate corporation, which in her own mind is precisely what she was running. What set St. Clair apart from her Harlem competitors wasn't just scale. It was her willingness to fight publicly, in print, in a city where the mob preferred to settle disputes with silence and bodies. She placed paid advertisements in the New York Amsterdam News, Harlem's most influential black newspaper, based for years near 2223 7th Avenue, naming corrupt police officers, describing shakedowns and payoffs in specific detail, daring the department to deny it. This was extraordinary. Numbers operators depended on discretion to survive, publicity invited raids. But St. Clair understood something the quieter bankers didn't. The police corruption devouring her profits through weekly bribes was, in its own way, more dangerous long-term than any single arrest, and only public shame might slow it. Between 1929 and 1933, she was arrested multiple times and served at least one stint on Welfare Island, now Roosevelt Island, for numbers-related charges. Each time, she came back and kept writing. By 1930, the numbers racket across Harlem was generating estimates ranging widely, but contemporary press and later Dewey-era investigations put the citywide policy business, much of it centered in Harlem, at somewhere between $15 and $20 million a year in bets. That is a staggering figure for the depths of the Depression, and it did not go unnoticed downtown. Prohibition, which had made fortunes for bootleggers running beer and whiskey into New York City through the docks of Brooklyn and the warehouses of the Bronx, was visibly dying by the early 1930s. Public opinion had turned, enforcement had become theater, and the 21st Amendment would formally end it in December 1933. Every bootlegger in the city could read the writing on the wall, and the smartest among them were already looking for the next racket that could absorb their gunmen, their trucks, and their capital. Few rackets looked as ripe or as undefended as Harlem's numbers business. The man who moved first and moved hardest was Arthur Flegenheimer, known to the city and to history as Dutch Schultz, born in the Bronx in 1902 to German Jewish immigrant parents. Schultz had clawed his way up through prohibition bootlegging into control of the beer trade across much of the Bronx and Manhattan, backed by a network of speakeasies, corrupt police contacts, and a reputation for brutal personal violence that even his own underworld peers found excessive. By 1931, Schultz commanded an organization built for exactly this kind of expansion. Enforcers used to intimidating rival beer distributors, a legal team skilled at delay, and critically, a mathematician. Otto Abadaba Berman, a former vaudeville performer with a genuine gift for numbers, worked out a method to manipulate the winning digits after bets were already placed by wiring last-minute wagers to shift the racetrack totals the winning number was drawn from. It was a form of insider fraud no independent Harlem bank could match because it required exactly the scale and cross-city communication network that only an organization like Schultz's possessed. Schultz's takeover of Harlem numbers, beginning in earnest around 1931 and 1932, did not arrive as a negotiation. It arrived as a campaign of kidnappings and beatings aimed at Harlem's independent bank owners. Men who ran their own numbers operations were seized off the street, held until they agreed to accept Schultz's protection, or simply beaten badly enough that the message reached every other banker within a day. Protection in this arrangement meant surrendering a cut of the take and, more insidiously, surrendering the ability to insure against a run of lucky bettors, because now that insurance had to be purchased from Schultz's organization at his price. Some Harlem bankers folded quickly, calculating correctly that Schultz's gunmen would not stop at property damage. Others held out. Stephanie St. Clair was among the small number who refused outright, and she did so in the same way she had fought the police, publicly, loudly, and on paper. St. Clair's resistance to Schultz was not merely stubbornness. It was a genuinely strategic bet that the city's political winds were shifting in her favor, or at least in a direction that might make an alliance of convenience possible. New York City in 1932 was reeling from the resignation of Mayor Jimmy Walker, forced out amid the Seabury Commission's investigation into municipal corruption, an inquiry that had exposed graft running through the police department, the magistrates' courts, and Tammany Hall itself. Reform was suddenly a live political current, and in November 1933, Fiorello LaGuardia, a Republican fusion candidate, who despised Tammany's machine as much as he despised organized crime, was elected mayor of New York City. LaGuardia would go on to appoint Louis Valentine as police commissioner, a man who built his reputation on gambling and vice raids. For an operator like St. Clair, this created a genuine, if narrow opening, a city government that at least claimed to be hostile to the corruption networks that had long protected men like Schultz. The tragedy, from St. Clair's perspective, was that reform-era policing rarely distinguished between the mob boss squeezing Harlem and the Harlem-born operator trying to survive him. Valentine's raids hit Numbers banks indiscriminately, and St. Clair found herself simultaneously fighting Schultz's gunmen, dodging corrupt cops who wanted payoffs to look the other way, and now facing an anti-vice crusade that treated her operation as no different from his. She kept writing to the Amsterdam News anyway, describing specific instances of police shakedowns, describing Schultz's incursions, effectively daring both the underworld and City Hall to act on what she published. It was an astonishing risk for a black woman running an illegal business in 1932, and it worked, in the narrow sense that it kept her name and her defiance in the public record, but it did not stop the guns. For muscle, St. Clair increasingly relied on a young man named Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known across Harlem as Bumpy Johnson, born in Charleston, South Carolina, and by the early 1930s a rising enforcer with a reputation for intelligence as much as violence. The exact date Johnson began working directly for St. Clair is debated among historians. Some accounts place their alliance as early as 1930, others closer to 1932, but by the time Schultz's war on independent Harlem bankers was in full swing, Johnson was functioning as St. Clair's chief protector, tasked with defending her runners and collectors from Schultz's men on the street level, in the doorways and stairwells where the actual violence of the Numbers war played out, far from any courtroom or newspaper column. The violence was real, and it was not symbolic. Numbers runners were beaten. Collection points were smashed. There are documented accounts of Schultz's men firebombing or vandalizing operations that refused his terms, and of at least one attempt on St. Clair's own operation that she publicly attributed to Schultz's organization in her newspaper broadsides. Meanwhile, Schultz was consolidating with a speed that stunned even his rivals in the wider underworld. By some estimates, within roughly 2 years he had absorbed a majority of Harlem's independent numbers banks into his network, backed by Abadaba Berman's fixed number scheme, which meant that even bankers who wanted to stay independent found themselves unable to compete financially. If you didn't have Berman's wire network, shaving the odds in your favor, you were simply going to lose more often to lucky Harlem bettors than an organization that could manipulate the draw. It was not a fair fight on any level, not the guns, and not the math. While Schultz tightened his grip on Harlem, the ground was shifting beneath his entire criminal apparatus in ways that had nothing directly to do with the numbers racket at all. In 1931, the assassination of Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria and the subsequent restructuring of Italian organized crime under Charles Lucky Luciano had produced something new in the American underworld. The Commission, a loose governing council meant to arbitrate disputes between crime families and prevent exactly the kind of chaotic, headline-grabbing violence that invited political crackdowns. Schultz, though not Italian himself, operated within reach of this new order because his territory and his ambitions overlapped with Luciano's own expanding interests in Manhattan gambling and vice. The Commission's preference always was for profit conducted quietly. Schultz's method, kidnapping, public beatings, newspaper-worthy brutality against a black businesswoman who was actively publicizing every incident, was exactly the kind of noise the Commission feared, because noise brought prosecutors, and prosecutors were coming. In 1935, Governor Herbert Lehman of New York State, under pressure from a grand jury investigation into rackets that the sitting district attorney seemed unable or unwilling to pursue, appointed Thomas E. Dewey as special prosecutor with a mandate to dismantle organized crime's grip on New York City's economy. Dewey was young, ambitious, and unusually difficult to bribe, a genuine anomaly in a city where prosecutors, judges, and police captains had for decades treated racketeering cases as negotiable. Dewey's investigators began building tax evasion and racketeering cases against the city's biggest crime figures, using the same playbook that had already sent Al Capone to federal prison in Chicago. You didn't need to prove the murders if you could prove the money. Schultz, whose numbers empire alone was throwing off staggering untaxed income, became one of Dewey's primary targets. Schultz's response to Dewey's investigation revealed exactly why the wider commission had grown wary of him. Rather than absorbing the legal pressure the way Luciano's organization preferred, through lawyers, delay, and quiet payoffs, Schultz reportedly proposed to the commission that Dewey simply be assassinated. This was, by every account of underworld politics at the time, an act of almost suicidal recklessness. Killing a sitting special prosecutor investigating organized crime would have triggered a law enforcement response of a scale New York's underworld had never faced, threatening every criminal enterprise in the city, not just Schultz's numbers racket. The commission, according to accounts that emerged from later trials and from informants including Abe Kid Twist Rails, voted against the plan, and fearing Schultz would attempt it anyway on his own initiative, voted instead to have Schultz killed first. On the night of October 23, 1935, gunmen, most notably Charles the Bug Workman, a murdering hitman working for the Commission's enforcement arm run out of Brooklyn, walked into the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, where Schultz was meeting with associates, and opened fire. Schultz was shot in the men's room and in the torso, and though he survived long enough to be taken to Newark City Hospital, he died the next day on October 24, 1935, still delirious, reportedly muttering a stream of famous, disjointed last words that a police stenographer transcribed, almost verbatim phrases about French-Canadian bean soup and a man named Henry that have puzzled and amused historians ever since without ever fully resolving into sense. Harlem's reaction, when the news broke, was not universal mourning. It is widely reported, though treated by some historians as folklore adjacent given the lack of a surviving physical copy, that Stephanie St. Clair sent a telegram to the dying Schultz that read something close to "As ye sow, so shall ye reap," a line quoted in contemporary press coverage of his death. Whether the exact wording is historically airtight or slightly embellished in retelling, the sentiment is entirely consistent with the woman who had spent 4 years publicly naming her tormentors in the Amsterdam News. And the moment captures something essential about the war Schultz had waged on Harlem. It was personal to her in a way it may never have been to him. He had seen Harlem's numbers business as a line item to be seized. She had seen it as something closer to a community institution, built imperfectly, but built by and for people the rest of the city's economy had shut out. But here is the turn the story demands, the one that separates a satisfying revenge narrative from the actual harder history. Schultz's death did not return the numbers racket to Harlem. It handed it to people even further removed from the neighborhood than he had been. With Schultz gone, the vacuum in Harlem's numbers business was filled not by a restoration of independent black-run banks, but by an absorption into the broader structure Luciano's commission had already built for organizing vice across the city. Figures like Frank Costello, and later the ambitious Michael "Trigger Mike" Coppola, moved into the space Schultz's organization had vacated, applying the same basic model: outside financing, outside enforcement, a cut skimmed off the top and sent downtown, but now embedded within a more disciplined, less publicity-hungry commission structure that had learned exactly the wrong lesson from Schultz's downfall. Not that seizing Harlem's economy was wrong, but that seizing it loudly was bad business. Bumpy Johnson's role in this transition is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, and where later folklore has often smoothed over real ambiguity. Johnson, St. Clair's former enforcer, emerged in the years after Schultz's death as the central black figure controlling, or, more precisely, managing on behalf of Italian mob interests, the visible operations of Harlem's numbers business. Various accounts describe Johnson negotiating a working arrangement with Costello's organization in the years following 1935 and into the 1940s, an arrangement that allowed a black-run front to remain publicly visible in Harlem, easing community friction and quieting the moral outrage that had made Schultz's takeover so combustible, while the deeper financing, protection and profit distribution flowed to the same downtown interests that had backed Schultz in the first place. It was, in effect, a more sustainable version of the same theft, less violent on the surface, more durable underneath, and dressed in the appearance of black control that made it politically survivable in a way Schultz's brute force method never could have been long-term. This is the deal the title of this story refers to, not a single signed document because none exists, but the practical settlement that emerged from Schultz's death, an underworld consensus brokered through the Commission's post-war structure that Harlem's numbers economy would remain nominally black-fronted but structurally controlled by organized crime networks whose leadership, financing, and ultimate profits sat downtown and in the outer boroughs, far from the tenements on Lenox Avenue, where the pennies were actually collected. Stephanie St. Clair, the one figure who had fought loudest against exactly this outcome, found herself with no meaningful role in the settlement that followed the very war she had waged. Her personal life in these years took its own dramatic turn, one that ended her public career less through underworld politics than through a marriage gone violently wrong. In the early 1930s, St. Clair had married Sufi Abdul Hamid, a charismatic and controversial Harlem labor organizer known for leading boycotts against white-owned businesses that refused to hire black employees, campaigns that made him both admired and deeply distrusted, with some contemporaries accusing him of anti-Semitic rhetoric during his organizing, a charge that remains debated among historians of the period. The marriage was volatile from the start and did not last. In 1938, Sinclair shot Hamid, wounding him, in what she later described as a response to his infidelity and abuse. She was convicted and sentenced to a term at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, New York State's women's prison in Westchester County, serving roughly 2 years before her release around 1946. By the time she emerged from Bedford Hills, the Harlem she had once ruled had changed in ways that went beyond the numbers racket alone. World War II had pulled tens of thousands of Harlem residents into war industries and military service, reshaping the neighborhood's economy and its demographics. The post-war years brought new waves of migration, new housing pressures, and eventually the first cracks in the informal economy that numbers running had represented for a generation. St. Clair herself largely withdrew from public life after her release, and detailed records of her final decades are sparse, another gap in a biography she herself had always kept partly obscured. She died in 1969, and even the exact circumstances and location of her death are recorded with less certainty than one would expect for a woman who had once taken out newspaper advertisements naming corrupt police captains by rank and precinct. The consequences of the deal that followed Schultz's death rippled through Harlem for decades, largely invisible to anyone not looking specifically for them. The numbers racket did not disappear after 1935, far from it. It continued as one of Harlem's largest sources of informal employment and informal capital well into the 1960s, sustaining a shadow economy that, because it remained illegal, could never be taxed to fund the schools, housing, or infrastructure that a legitimate industry of comparable size would have supported. Money that might have built Harlem instead flowed disproportionately to organized crime networks with no roots in the neighborhood and no interest in reinvesting there. This is the quiet structural tragedy underneath the gangland drama. Harlem residents kept placing bets, kept running the same risks, kept generating the same staggering annual revenues, but an ever larger share of that money now left the neighborhood permanently, routed through Costello's and later other families' downtown channels, rather than circulating through black-owned banks, businesses, and civic institutions the way it had, however imperfectly, under Holstein and Sinclair. Bumpy Johnson's own later career illustrates just how entrenched this arrangement became. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, Johnson operated as Harlem's most visible black underworld figure, doing time himself at various points, including a lengthy federal sentence at Alcatraz in the 1950s, while maintaining his working relationship with the descendants of the same commission structure that had absorbed Schultz's territory. By the 1960s, as heroin began devastating Harlem streets, Johnson found himself in conflict with Italian organized crime figures over control of the drug trade, rather than the numbers racket, a conflict that reflected how thoroughly the city's underworld hierarchy had normalized outside control over Harlem's illegal economies, whatever the specific product being sold. The numbers racket's original sin, in other words, established a template that outlasted the numbers racket itself. The formal end of the era came not through law enforcement triumph, but through legalization. In 1967, New York State voters approved a constitutional amendment permitting a state-run lottery, and the New York State Lottery began operations the following year, offering a legal alternative to the same basic wager Harlem had been placing illegally for 4 decades. The legal lottery never fully displaced the illegal numbers game for years. Many Harlem residents actually preferred the old system, since it offered better odds, smaller minimum bets, and crucially, no taxes withheld from winnings, but it marked the state's recognition that this appetite for a small, hopeful daily wager was too large and too persistent to keep criminalizing indefinitely. It was a strange, belated vindication of what Caspar Holstein and Stephanie St. Clair had understood in the 1920s. That this was at its core ordinary people's finance, built around ordinary people's hope, and it had simply taken New York State roughly 40 years and one state constitutional amendment to admit as much. What makes this story more than a colorful footnote to Prohibition-era gangster history is the way it reveals New York City's underlying economic architecture during the interwar decades. Harlem in the 1920s and 1930s was, by any reasonable measure, generating extraordinary wealth large enough to interest the most powerful crime organization in the Bronx, wealth large enough eventually to draw the attention of a state constitutional amendment. And yet almost none of the formal financial infrastructure of New York City, not its banks, not its insurance companies, not its stock exchanges just a few miles downtown on Wall Street, would touch that neighborhood's money on legitimate terms. The numbers racket existed precisely because the legitimate economy had drawn a color line around Harlem's capital, and once an illegal economy of that scale existed, it was, with grim predictability, eventually seized by exactly the kind of organized violence that legitimate regulation is supposed to prevent. Stephanie St. Clair spent the most dangerous years of her life fighting not just Dutch Schultz, but the entire logic of a city that had made her business illegal while making legitimate banking inaccessible, leaving her no protected ground to defend at all. It is worth sitting for a moment with the specific geography of that fight, because the streets themselves tell you what was really at stake. Walk 7th Avenue between 130th and 145th Streets today, past the site where the old Amsterdam news offices once stood, past the corner where the Renaissance ballroom drew Harlem's dancers, past brownstones that once housed policy banks in their parlors and their basement kitchens, and you are walking through what was, for roughly 15 years, one of the largest informal financial districts in the United States, a shadow Wall Street built by immigrants and migrants, the real Wall Street would not admit. Every runner climbing a Lenox Avenue tenement stairwell with slips of paper folded into their coat pocket was moving real capital through a real economy, one that employed, by some estimates, thousands of Harlem residents directly as runners, collectors, and clerks. That economy's capture by Dutch Schultz and its subsequent quieter absorption into the broader structure of organized crime after his death was not simply a gangland turf war. It was one of the earliest and starkest examples of a wealth extraction pattern that would recur across Harlem's 20th century, a neighborhood generating enormous value that consistently failed to remain within the neighborhood's own hands. Stephanie St. Clair's public fight against that extraction, waged through advertisements, through arrests, she treated almost as publicity opportunities, through a documented willingness to name police corruption by rank and precinct, at a time when doing so invited retaliation from every direction, deserves to be remembered as something more than a colorful supporting role in Dutch Schultz's downfall. She was, by the historical record, one of the very few operators of any race or gender in Prohibition and Depression-era New York who treated organized crimes incursions as a matter for public accountability rather than private negotiation. It did not save her business, it did not restore Harlem's numbers economy to black ownership after Schultz died, and the deal that followed his assassination proved, if anything, more durable and less contestable than his own violent reign had been, precisely because it was quieter. But her resistance left a documented record, in the pages of the Amsterdam News, in police files, in the memory of a Harlem that told and retold her story for generations, that insists on a basic fact, easy to lose in the gangster mythology that grew up around Dutch Schultz's blood-soaked final years. Harlem's numbers racket was not simply stolen by the mob in some inevitable historical footnote. It was built by Black and Caribbean New Yorkers, defended by at least one woman who refused every incentive to go quiet, and taken by force by men who then structured its theft to look from a safe distance like nothing had really changed at all.